Welcome. My name is Matt Rodjansky, and I'm director of the Wilson Center's Kennan Institute. Thank you all so much for joining us for today's event, Perspectives on the 30th Anniversary of 1991 and the Collapse of the Soviet Union. Although the dissolution of the Soviet Union was years in the making, this month marks the formal end of the Soviet Union, and of course was bookended by vitally important events, including the Ukrainian declaration at the beginning of the month and Mikhail Gorbachev's final departure, the lowering of the red flag and exit from the Kremlin at Christmas of 1991. We are so fortunate to be joined today by three experienced experts on the period, including two who played, I would say, leading roles on the stage of that drama for today's discussion. The event is part of a series that are commemorating the anniversary, and we invite you to join our event on December 13th, which will discuss Vladislav Zubok's new book, Collapse: The Fall of the Soviet Union, which is co-sponsored with the Wilson Center's History and Public Policy program. A reminder that you can stay up to date with all of our upcoming events and publications on our website and with our podcasts, Kennan X and the Russia File. And you can find our analysis of events in Ukraine, Russia, and the region on our Focus Ukraine and Russia File blogs. We are also going to feature a series of multimedia projects looking at snapshots of countries in the former Soviet region over the next several weeks. So please keep an eye on our social media for links to those. I am going to introduce each of our speakers in turn. So first I will introduce Andrei Kozyrev and he will speak, and then I will introduce Ambassador Jim Collins and he will speak, and then Diana Negroponte. But at any time, including right now, I invite you to submit your questions via email to Kennan, that's Kennan at wilsoncenter.org. You can also tweet them to @Kennan Institute, or you can post them on our Facebook page. And of course, it's helpful to me to know your name and affiliation, and even more helpful if your question actually ends with a question mark. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our first speaker, Andrei Kozyrev. He was, of course, the first foreign minister of the Russian Federation, having previously served as foreign minister of the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic starting in October of 1990. He was an early proponent for increased cooperation between the United States and Russia and advocated for an end to the Cold War. He participated in the historic decision taken in December 1991 by the leaders of Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine to peacefully dissolve the Soviet Union. And as Russia's first foreign minister, he promoted a policy of equal cooperation with the newly independent states of the former Soviet Union, and of course also improved relations with Russia's immediate neighbors and with the West. He left the post of foreign minister in January 1996, but continued in politics representing the northern city of Murmansk in the Russian Duma for 4 years. Since 2000, Kozyrev has lectured on international affairs and served on the boards of a number of Russian and international companies. So, Andrei, the Zoom room is yours.
First, I unmute myself, but before we forget, I would like to recognize Mikhail Gorbachev as an outstanding historic figure, and his vacation, this peaceful attitude during those days when the Soviet Union was actually collapsing, and he was losing his position as a president, so-called president of the Soviet Union, and going just to be a private citizen. That was historic contribution, and I just want to say that he started the process of democratization in Russia. You might argue how successful it was and how straightforward it was, but his acts in those last days, which helped tremendously to avoid bloodshed, to avoid a civil war, deserve historic recognition. Going about the events, you can read probably a lot in my memoir, which Matt was a godfather of, the memoir called, of course, The Firebird. The firebird is the symbol of a creature which, if caught, provides happiness to the not only to the one who catches it, but to everyone. And the revolutionary events of the dissolution of the Soviet Union, peaceful dissolution of the Soviet Union, which is a little bit, I think, underappreciated, that this tremendous development happened orderly, legally, and peacefully. That was the third attempt to modify outdated and archaic, if not barbarous in many aspects, political and legal system of Russia. First attempt was, of course, March of 17, when the Tsar was deposed, and an attempt to create a democratic Russian government was made, but it ended up actually in free and fair elections through Russia, despite the inevitable commotion and chaos of this kind of events. But the election succeeded, and the Bolshevik party was in hopeless minority. So it was rather successful. But what broke the spine of the so-called provisional government, which actually provided for the elections, was the war on the west of Russia, Germany and Austro-Hungarian empires, and that war was too much a burden to, and it prevented the democratic development. Then Bolsheviks took power. That was second attempt. They tried it their way, which was completely wrong, and ended up with Stalin's dictatorship, which was even worse than the Tsarist regime. And that failed in the early 90s, and the Soviet Union collapsed because that attempt also did not work. And our attempt was basically the same, to introduce in Russia and hopefully in other newly constituted independent states a democratic regime. We made considerable progress on that way, including a new constitution, which was a progressive constitution. But we failed because the large part of Russian elite, especially the KGB forces, were not reformed and continued to stick to the old conceptions of Russia as empire, of Russia as enemy of the West, in total contradiction with the real situation, when it was first time that Russia was not threatened, and still today is not threatened from the West. NATO provides a guarantee for Russian security on the Western borders. Actually, Russia could not even have now a border guards there, because they will take care of that. The NATO countries like Poland and others. So Russia now tries, the Kremlin regime actually, now tries to stop Ukraine from joining democratic countries and building democracy. So unfortunately, our third attempt also failed. Unfortunately, there is little hope for a evolutionary development in Russia. And again, it probably will come down to the catastrophic kind of developments. The March Revolution was peaceful of 17, but in general, the 17th was a catastrophic, the beginning of the catastrophic events because the country was not prepared for evolution. The same happened in our time. The Soviet monolith just collapsed in no time by historic measures, and it was a catastrophic change in a sense, though again peaceful. So unfortunately, probably next time it will be again not an evolutionary development change, but rather a catastrophic of some kind, and hopefully again peaceful. That's the most important part. So that's where we are.
Thanks very much, Andrei. I will next introduce Ambassador Jim Collins, who of course served as U.S. Ambassador in the Russian Federation from 1997 to 2001. Before that, he was Ambassador at Large and Special Advisor to the Secretary of State for the newly independent states in the mid-1990s. But I think in some sense, most immediately relevant to our narrative today about the events of 30 years ago is that he was Deputy Chief of Mission and crucially chargé d'affaires, so the senior U.S. diplomat at the U.S. Embassy in Moscow during the 1990 to 93 time period, including, I think, rather famously, Jim, I won't steal your thunder, in August of 1991 when the coup attempt occurred. He has received a great many honors, including the Secretary of State's Award for Distinguished Service, the Department of State's Distinguished Honor Award, the Award for Career Achievement, the Department of Defense Medal for Distinguished Public Service, and in fact, the NASA Medal for Distinguished Service. He's active on the boards of many nonprofits concerned with U.S. foreign policy and relations with Russia and the region, including the U.S.-Russia Business Council and the American Academy of Diplomacy. And before joining the State Department, he taught Russian and European history, American government, and economics at the U.S. Naval Academy. He is currently the diplomat in residence at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. And I cannot not add that Jim has been a mentor of mine for many years as I worked for him as his deputy at the Carnegie Endowment, in what I pride myself on saying, if I'm the godfather of Andrei's autobiographical Firebird novel, I am the last in a long line of Jim Collins deputies, which includes some folks very active on the stage of Russia, Ukraine, and the region today. So Jim is exactly the right person to tell us how to think about this. Jim.
Well, you're very generous, Matt, and I would only tell everybody that I've probably learned more from Matt than he has from me. I want to start with a point that my wife has made considerably strongly to me many times, and that is there's a difference between a historian and a political actor. Political actor is in events as they take place, and the one thing he never knows is exactly how they're going to turn out. The historian knows how things turned out and tries to understand how that political actor could possibly have done so many dumb things. So it's with that in mind that I say I arrived in Moscow in the end of summer 1990. And I was there for the next 3 years, which transformed the entire area of the Eurasian landmass, the former Soviet space, if you will. And I arrived in many ways at the sort of culmination in many ways of the Gorbachev effort to transform the Soviet Union, its economy, its political system, its socioeconomic and information structure that had changed beyond recognition for me. I was struck that one of the first things I did was take a walk on the famous Arbat Street in Moscow. And the first thing I ran into was a Hare Krishna group jingling their bells, walking up the Arbat. I can tell you that in 1965 or in 1973, when I was in Moscow, that was not going to be possible. So things had changed dramatically under Mr. Gorbachev. But it was also true that I arrived, in a sense, at the kind of point where the challenge to those changes had grown and strengthened. And in many ways, the momentum of those changes had lost its capacity to control events. And we were watching, as I arrived, what I would say was the effort by the hardline people who wanted to maintain the old system, take greater and greater authority in the system, and ultimately try to halt completely the effort by Mr. Gorbachev to transform the political structure and economic structure and retain and reinvigorate, if you will, the centrally controlled Communist Party-dominated system of the Soviet Union. The result of that was the coup in August 1991. It was, in a sense, the last gasp of the old line to try to stop the momentum for change. They lost. It did not succeed. And the result was a continuation of an economic, political, institutional, and in many ways intellectual revolution that brought to a conclusion the control of the Eurasian world by those who had created the Soviet Union and ruled it for some 74 years. It was a perfect storm by the time we came to December. It had, first of all, ended the role of the Communist Party. And with that, in a sense, it ended the capacity of the Soviet-created institutions to function the way they were designed. The political structures of the Soviet Union were meant to be run by the Communist Party, and the governmental structures were meant to manage and institute what the Communist Party decided would be policy and what would be program. Well, suddenly the party wasn't there, and the institutions of government were not used to taking that role of leadership and deciding where the country would go or how it would develop. Secondly, you had an economic disaster. The government's capacity to serve the very minimal needs of its people, including in many ways the fear that they would not have enough food by the end of 1991, was undermining the authority or faith in the government institutions across the entire country. And thirdly, there was, in essence, what I will call the Tribal Revolt. The idea that nobody in the republics, the republic leadership, seeing that the government in Moscow could no longer assure their needs or answer their requirements, was in any way something they could support or kept alive. So where Ukraine in early 1990 had voted basically to keep the Union, in December 1st, 1991, a referendum decided that they would leave the Union. And then we come to the anniversary we are at today. And I remember very well, and I recently, just today, looked at the news broadcast for December 9th, 1991 in Moscow. And what it was announcing was the results of what was known as the Byelovezh Accords. This was an agreement between the presidents or leaders of Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia to end the Soviet Union, create a new Commonwealth of independent sovereign states, in a sense, to design their own approach to the future of the Eurasian region that would end the Soviet Union structure as it was constituted, or even as Mr. Gorbachev sought to reform it, and transform it into a commonwealth of freely associated independent states. There's a case to be made that 3 days later, when the Russian Federation's Supreme Soviet voted to withdraw from the Soviet Union in accord with the Soviet Constitution, the Soviet Union actually came to an end, even though the flag didn't get hauled down until Christmas Day 1991. But the end of this process was a function of, frankly, the inability of the central government of the Soviet system to satisfy the minimal needs of its public, the lack of any ability to govern effectively further, and in some sense, the fact that people just didn't care to preserve it anymore. I've said a number of times to people that the Soviet Union was actually canceled for lack of interest. There was simply no one out there ready to preserve it. Now, I want to say only a couple of words about what was America up to in all of this. The United States, really until very late in the game, until I would say in November, was to the extent it could, working to ensure that Mr. Gorbachev would retain the capacity to deliver on the kinds of important agreements and trends that he was promoting that were in the ultimate interests of the United States. First of all, that had to do with the nuclear weaponry and strategic, what we might call today strategic stability. He had been there as our partner to end the Cold War. He was there as our partner to sign in July the critical agreement reducing the number of nuclear weapons. He was basically also working, it seemed, or trying to create a new kind of economy, a new kind of institutional structure, something that would agree to greater respect for human rights. He had helped us end the terrible problem that was divisive between us of Jewish immigration. So we had a strong interest in a sense, in helping that Gorbachev would retain the capacity to maintain momentum in those directions. But we also, by November, and I know that in fact it was in the Madrid agreement, when our ambassador in Moscow basically said to people in Madrid at the summit meeting about the Middle East, he told Jim Baker that Mr. Gorbachev wasn't going to make it. And there was a beginning of us planning for, all right, what do we do then? Well, there were, I would say, 3 critical issues on our agenda. First and foremost was concern about the nuclear arsenal, that it be kept under control and management that would not permit anything like a sort of free-for-all of everybody fooling around with nuclear weapons across all of Eurasia. So we did, in fact, want to see the Russian Federation get its hands on and maintain control over the nuclear arsenal. The second was, frankly, to prevent the Eurasian landmass from becoming another Yugoslavia. Nobody had any assurance that we would not see civil war somewhere break out and erupt, as it had, as Andrei observed, in 1917 and after. And this, of course, in a country with nuclear weapons, not something that anybody felt we could do anything except hope and do everything possible to prevent. And finally, there was the economic disaster. There was the concern that there was not going to be enough to eat across much of Eurasia in that very difficult winter of 1991-92. The United States was providing aid, Europe was providing aid, but frankly, it was not enough to stop the concern. So as the Soviet Union came to a close and the new leadership in Ukraine and Russia and Belarus and Kazakhstan and so on took over, they were both optimistic that they had a good future, but they inherited a tremendous set of problems. And it was in that world that I spent the next 2 years working with two administrations, trying to help define policies that would bring Russia along and answer its interests, and above all, prevent the worst from happening of a civil war or somehow the loss of control over the nuclear arsenal. So thanks, Matt.
Thanks so much, Jim. Before I introduce Diana Negroponte, just one more reminder, we are already getting a wonderful assortment of audience questions, but for those who've tuned in late, email KENNAN, that's Kennan, @wilsoncenter.org. Tweet to us at Kennan Institute or write on our Facebook page to pose a question, please, with your name and affiliation and a question mark. So now, let me introduce Diana Negroponte, who is a global fellow at the Wilson Center, and I must say, one of the most gracious, deeply insightful, and just simply delightful colleagues of mine over many years here at the Wilson Center. She has researched and completed a diplomatic history of the last years of the Cold War with a focus on the role of the aforementioned Secretary of State, Jim Baker, titled Master Negotiator, the Role of James A. Baker III at the End of the Cold War. Prior to joining the Wilson Center, Dr. Negroponte was a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution and contributed to the history of the U.S. Institute of Peace. She practiced international trade and aviation law at Paul Hastings, Janofsky, and Walker, and participated in the discussion on the dispute resolution chapter of NAFTA at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce in Mexico City. She has also authored Seeking Peace in El Salvador, The Struggle to Reconstruct a Nation at the End of the Cold War, in 2011, and published in El Salvador in 2016, as well as The End of Nostalgia, Mexico Confronts the Challenge of Global Competition, published in 2013, and of course, a great many articles and media appearances. Diana, without further ado, the floor is yours.
Matt, thank you very much. And to my two colleagues on this panel, my huge appreciation. I had a wonderful interview with Foreign Minister Kozyrev. And Ambassador Collins, I read your work because I know that you presented your ideas at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, and a report was drawn up after it. My approach this morning is that of the US government's observance of what was happening in the Soviet Union. And I do not have that deep knowledge of what was happening within the Soviet government, within the entourage around Gorbachev, or, as Foreign Minister Kozyrev knows, those around Boris Yeltsin. But I am going to seek to answer this question. When did the US government begin to doubt the ability of Mikhail Gorbachev to carry through his reforms? And if he failed, what were the consequences? And I think we have to start thinking about this in the early summer of 1989, when the Polish people were allowed to vote for their Senate. Now, this was only 100 seats, but the labor union, the famous Solidarity, Solidarsk, was allowed to run as a political party, and it won 99 of those 100 seats. This was a message to the whole of Eastern Europe. Moscow will tolerate democratic elections. Moscow does not send in the troops. And both in Poland and Hungary and Czechoslovakia and Romania, the message went through, let's test it. So we had the famous picnic in the summer of 1989, when the Hungarians broke through the barbed wire fence and ran into Austria. And Moscow did not respond. And the Warsaw Troop did not respond. We all know about November's fall of the Berlin Wall. And Gorbachev talked with a colleague of all of us, Ambassador Ischinger, who went to Moscow 2 days after the fall of that wall. And Gorbachev turned to these West Germans and said, don't worry, After they've tasted the bananas and the sex shops of West Berlin, they'll all come home. Well, they didn't. And in the next few days, we know that East Germans flocked into the West because they knew that that system which they had lived under for 40 years was crumbling. And still, the Warsaw Pact troops stayed in barracks. They did not move. So there was a time of great uncertainty. And when Ambassador Collins went to Moscow in that summer of 1990, he was uncertain too. Would the apparatchiks in the Kremlin pull down Gorbachev and reassert the power and the political and military force of the Soviet Union? Or would they allow it to disintegrate peacefully? So I take it now to Baker and President Bush's thoughtfulness in May of 1990, when the people of Lithuania on May 1 decided to assert their independence, to declare independence. And the military in the Soviet Union did not approve of this, and they knew the consequences for the 3 Baltic states. If Lithuania went independent, so too Estonia and Latvia. So this was a moment of danger, not only for Gorbachev and the government, but also for Bush and his team in the White House, because they were counting on the stability of Gorbachev's management of the Soviet government. And if that stability was wrecked, what might happen? Would there be a turn towards fascism? Or would there be a disintegration on the style and scale of Federation of Yugoslavia? So Washington persuaded the Lithuanian leadership, Mr. Landsbergis, known as the piano player. They persuaded Landsbergis to delay, to defer, despite significant pressure from the Lithuanian community in the United States. So we move from that May number to the arms control negotiations which take place that summer. And instead of progress, there is pushback. The Soviet negotiators do not have the same liberty that they had before to move on conventional forces in Europe, or the strategic arms reduction known in short as START. So there's evidence that the ability of the government to assert more amicable relations with the West was disappearing. When would it happen? How it would happen was still an unknown. And both you gentlemen have taken us through the putsch of August 1991. And very important, the resignation of Gaidar. No, not Gaidar, let me just look at my notes. But Andrei Ambassador Collins would help me. The father of perestroika resigns a few days before the coup against Gorbachev, as if he knew it was coming. Thank you very much. I knew I was part of a team. But thereafter, the doubts in Washington are, can Gorbachev hold his Union Treaty? Can he retain control over the monetary policy as well as defense and foreign policy, leaving the domestic internal affairs of the 15 republics to their own choice? It was a deeply controversial Union Treaty. Gorbachev was vulnerable and alone. And after that coup, it was very evident that Boris Yeltsin, president of Russia, was the man who took the decisions. And he merely used Mikhail Gorbachev as the alliance, the league, the contact with the West. It was a disintegration, but Washington was determined to get certain foreign policy actions confirmed before the Soviet Union collapsed. The first was stay with us in removing Saddam from Kuwait. Second, confirm the START treaty, the Strategic Arms Treaty, and the Conventional Forces Treaty, and united Germany within NATO shall remain US and Soviet policy. But all the while they knew the weakening of Gorbachev, the rise of Yeltsin, and the implications that that meant for a union of Soviet socialist republics known by the acronym USSR. That was going. And Tom Friedman remembers that Christmas night when the flag of the Soviet Union came down and the flag of Russia went up above the Kremlin. It was the end.
Well, thank you very much, Diana, and indeed to all three of you. I am going to do the usual moderator's prerogative role, because how could I not, and hold a few of our audience questions, but we have plenty of time, and I promise I will get to as many of them as possible. I think all or most. I do encourage you to continue to submit. Let me start though with what I suspect is on a lot of minds this week in particular, based on news events. It would seem that this history and the events that have just been described are on the minds of leaders in Moscow and also in Beijing, given the recent declaration on history by the Chinese Communist Party. But that's leaders. And what I want to ask is the degree to which each of you thinks that the events you're describing really were shaped or driven by leaders, rather than, if you will, bottom up. Was it not the reality that while Gorbachev initiated some things, he then lost control? Was it not the case that while the Ukrainian leaders, who were of course Communist Party leaders themselves, and everybody else may have had goals, they had to wait to see the results of a referendum? So were these events, these crucial developments, not fundamentally bottom up? And by the way, I could include, the decision of Russians in Moscow to come out into the streets in August of 1991. Were these not fundamentally bottom up events rather than sort of driven by the personalities of leaders? And I'll entertain anyone. Jim, you're unmuted if you want to begin on that, but anybody else who wants to comment as well.
Well, Matt, I think you raised a very profound point. I happen to believe that no government can survive that does not have the consent of the governed. Now, you can create that consent in many different ways. It can be done through democratic means and voting and so on. It can also be done through terror. The people basically agree that it's just not worth opposing a government. But I think it is fair to say that by late 1991, and certainly as a result of the coup, the Russian public, and probably the public of most of the other republics, had more or less withdrawn their consent of the governed, because the government wasn't delivering. It wasn't giving them enough to eat. It wasn't providing the health care. And in many ways, what you had was almost everybody down the line into the villages and collective farms looking out for himself, assuming only she could be responsible for survival. Well, that meant fundamentally there just weren't many people who saw a big interest in defending that kind of government. So I'd say it was more that it was, as I said before, it was kind of lack of interest in or lack of sense that this was vital to them that withdrew that consent. And once the consent was withdrawn, the government was just on borrowed time.
Very, very well said indeed. Andrei, Diana, do you want to comment on the question of bottom up versus top down? Please, Andrei, go ahead.
I agree with Jim that it was the people's will by large, prompted by economic difficulties, but also by the search of perspective of the firebrand, in a sense, because the example of the United States and other Western countries, especially European countries, which are closer to Russia, was a factor, probably a key factor, that Russian people started to think why people in Europe, which they kind of feel association with. If you ask a Russian who is closer to you, whom you associate yourself, it would not be Chinese, with all due respect, or Iranian, with all due respect again, or even Turkey, but it would be France, Germany, and Europe, and at a lesser extent on the people's on all level, America, but the example of the West, of democratic West, of democracy, which was delivering, also in economic terms, considerably better than the Soviet, even before 80s. That was a very strong factor. And this factor is the source of the fear and the source of the hostility of the present regime, which is more Soviet-like than a new Russia-like, by many criteria. That's why they hate the West. That's why they invented or reinvented the old old stories of the West being enemy and so on, while the situation is absolutely changed after the Second World War, and as I said, NATO, which they use as a scarecrow, actually is the best neighbor we can dream of, or any country could dream of, because it's evident that NATO will never attack Russia, even if Russia deserves it. They will probably use real force only if their borders are violated. It is so evident in the last crisis with the ongoing crisis with Ukraine. So that was a very important factor, and I agree that it was bottom up, but the results of those events very much depended on political guidance, on political figures, on leaders. And actually the event itself was kind of led by Yeltsin, who was a strong figure, and at that time really felt for the people. But later, unfortunately, both Gorbachev and Yeltsin, they failed to live up to the opportunity for a variety of reasons, and my humble self included, as a much minor figure, but still a participant. So yes, it was going from the people, but then the leaders should have taken over, and they failed in the end.
Thank you, Andrei. Diana, please.
I think we should never forget that Gorbachev's introduction of perestroika, restructuring, and glasnost, opening, introduced a reform so deep that the consequences were unknown. That man brought about the end of the Cold War, which is a different thing than the end of the Soviet Union, but nevertheless, there are links between. And I would not forget the contribution that he has played to be welcomed in the West, to be despised in Russia.
Let me ask another question of mine, and I want to ask this very precisely. As far as each of you understands, what were the expectations of each of the players, each of the sides in 1991-92, as far as the future role of NATO in European security? And I want to include in the sides certainly Moscow and Washington, but to the extent you would also comment on European actors and newly independent states, I think that'd be very helpful in light of events this week. Diana, you're unmuted, so why don't we start with you?
Thank you, Matt, thank you. Baker goes to NATO soon after, and Ambassador Collins will recall that, in order to ensure that there was a unified position by NATO members in reaching out to Russia. The purpose was not to create an enemy. The purpose was to have a relationship, maybe a new council, a new institution which could engage with Russia. Russia should not be humiliated. Russia should have a bridge to NATO. Thank you.
Jim, why don't we go to you next?
I think there is no question that the Russian side, as I was watching it and as part of it, first of all, hoped that NATO would disappear. Now, that was never to happen. It was never realistic. But if you asked, I think, Andrei, if you tell me if I'm wrong, but my sense was that the idea that NATO had been formed to protect the West from the Soviet Union sort of ceased to have a rationale that it had before, and it should go away. Now, once that wasn't going to happen, and once we got to the question of Germany unifying and bringing East Germany into NATO, then the question really was, all right, that's okay, and that's where it would. Then the idea is it should stop there. And for a time, the idea was, yes, there would be an open arrangement that would permit Russia and all of the new states, which we had been the driver to recognize as sovereign, independent members of the international community, would be welcome into these kinds of relationships. And this produced the Partnership for Peace. And that particular approach, at least at the early end of the 90s, was something that allowed a great deal of, I would say, constructive dialogue with Russia and all the other countries. And it set aside for a period NATO as a critical issue, set it aside at the particular time we were trying to negotiate the implementation of the START agreement. And so, which was terribly important. The withdrawal, the agreement to get the strategic nuclear weapons out of Ukraine, Belarus, and Kazakhstan was a critical priority in the early 90s, both for Bush and then for the first years of Clinton. And that period was sort of a honeymoon, I would say. But the problem we had was that the Russian side assumed that the old idea that Europe's future was going to be a joint undertaking by the Washington and Moscow was simply not shared in Washington. That Moscow was not going to have the equal voice that the other superpower had in the past. And that was the source of what was to become, I would say, the current troubles that we have today.
Thanks, Jim. Andrei, let me invite you to comment, but let me also ask, get a little closer maybe to where your microphone is, or project louder. It's been a little hard to hear you.
I think that it's important to remember that when we are saying Russia, there are two Russias. And all the time there were two Russias. There is no one Russia. There is a Russia which wants to be a normal country, a country mostly democratic, open markets, and that country did not care and does not care today about NATO, because as I said, NATO was created mostly against the Soviet Union, but NATO charter speaks of defense of values, of joint values. And Boris Yeltsin, who was leading the popular movement of that Russia which I am talking about, he actually immediately wrote a letter to NATO first days of his kind of a takeover of the Kremlin, asking to be a member, if not immediately, but later of NATO, because NATO was just sharing the same values and never presented any danger and welcomed the democratic Russia. But there was, and still is, that again dominates the Kremlin, the different Russia, which took NATO as a pretext to restore the enemy image of the West, the enemy image of the Western Europe, and especially of America, to defend their positions not in foreign policy. Foreign policy is just secondary, it's just a tool. But inside Russia, the KGB, the hardliners in the military-industrial complex, the bureaucracy, entrenched bureaucracy, unreformed. All those elements were not reformed, and they ill-conceived, or probably could not, probably could not be better. Anyway, the failed privatization only consolidated the economic power of the old bureaucracies, old regimes, and especially the KGB, because the KGB was the one most prepared to the new conditions. Why? You will be amused. Because they supported the communist parties, including in the United States, but especially in other countries, especially in developing countries, through using the same instruments which oligarchs today use in Russia. That is Cayenne Islands, or whatever, free zones where the identity could be hidden, but the money could be fueled to the communist parties and whoever you want to, anonymously. And they set up enterprises like today in the West. Part of that money they invest in the enterprises and get legal profits, and then use those profits for their purposes. So they were the most prepared for the new conditions. And all that led finally to, and again, the leadership, the new Russian leadership, failed to fundamentally reform those structures, which should have been done. And it was never done. That was cosmetic kind of changes. So we have the second Russia again back, and that's the point. I mean, that's the point with the NATO. Now NATO is a again, scarecrow that they will come to Ukraine. I mean, so what? What kind of NATO will come to Ukraine if Ukraine becomes a NATO country? Some probably weapons, but definitely not aggression. I was a deputy, elected deputy in Murmansk area. And Murmansk is bordering Norway. And guess what? Norway is a member of NATO. So the NATO is just across the border. And what happened? That Norway, NATO, attacked Murmansk when the Soviet Union collapsed, when it was weak point probably, and even chaos. And no, they opened up the border peacefully and established all kind of humanitarian assistance, economic cooperation, and ecological project, very, very beneficial to Murmansk area and to the north of Russia. So there is absolutely hard evidence that NATO would never attack, even in the most appropriate and most kind of convenient point if they wanted to attack. So it's all for the domestic purposes, and unfortunately, the propaganda, especially today, is strong enough to keep part of Russian people absolutely disoriented.
Thanks very much, Andrei, and to all three of you. I want to go now to some of our excellent audience questions. First, from Aram Avatissian from the Voice of America. What role did ethnic conflicts play in the collapsing USSR, and to what extent did ethnic conflicts, particularly the Karabakh issue, impact the disintegration process of the Soviet Union? Andrei, you're unmuted, so why don't you,
sorry,
if you like, why don't you comment on that first?
No, probably ladies first. And I made a mistake. I should not be rewarded for making it.
Minister Kozyrev, I do not know the answer. It's on you.
I don't doubt what you say, but I don't doubt that you don't know. Because before that, your presentations exposed very deep and detailed knowledge of many things. But ethnically, yes, of course. I mean, the Soviet Union was an empire, and not only Baltic states were taken by force. Actually, when Stalin and the period when Stalin and Hitler started the Second World War, but it was a very, very complicated story in many other places. But if you look at the Declaration of Independence issued by Georgia, for instance, because Georgia is a prey for Russian aggression in recent years, again, the Declaration of Independence of Georgia starts with historic fact that Georgia was taken by Russia, partly voluntarily, but partly by force. And of course, that part of what they expected to be involuntary protection against the Muslim environment in the Caucasus, that part was not honored by the Russian Tsar, and the regime of the Russian proper was installed all over the empire. And that's, as I said, was one of the reasons, because this regime, it was medieval type of absolutism, even worse than any kind of absolutism ever existed in the West. It was not I am the state, but it was I am the owner of the whole place. That's what the last Tsar said. So this kind of archaic political structure could not survive and could not satisfy the minorities or whatever it is. So, of course, I mean, and then the Stalin's was even worse, the Stalin's regime. And then the Stalin's actually basic foundations were never reformed in the Soviet Union, despite all the attempts. And even as Diana mentioned, when Baltic states tried under perestroika to obtain their independence, there was a bloody attempt to stop them from that. And Gorbachev played a double role, actually, during that period. He said that he did not know that the force was used. I mean, but that's total nonsense. I mean, the centralized, always centralized Soviet Union, that he could not know what happened, especially with the use of force. I mean, that's total bullshit, so to say. And I wonder why Washington, with all due respect, for so long time, tried to look sideways. And that's why Yeltsin was opposition leader when all that happened. The Soviet Union dissolved, and I was in his team. We were in a position, and we were under pressure before Gorbachev was kind of ousted by the coup plotters. And the coup plotters were appointed. It was all appointees by the Gorbachev himself, have hand chosen. So that's much more complicated story. But of course they wanted independence, and they got it.
Let me, Jim, I feel like the piece on what the U.S. was seeing in terms of ethnic conflicts in the late Soviet period, including in particular Armenia, Azerbaijan, I think that goes to you. But I want to add in another question that was directed specifically to you from Shipra Shukla, an educator, who asked, do you think that the political transition could have taken place in a way that didn't leave the state so vulnerable to oligarchs? So if you'll comment on both of those, please.
Okay. Well, first of all, I would suggest simply about Nagorno-Karabakh that is more a symptom than it is a cause. It's a symptom of the fact that the capacity of the state to ensure even political stability was weakening. In most of the Soviet era, the Nagorno-Karabakh issue was not a problem. You know, issues like that were solved very brutally or very quickly. By the time Nagorno-Karabakh comes along, the state is in a weakened position, and it becomes that kind of challenge. And as Andrei has mentioned, then you get similar kinds of open challenge to state authority from Gamsakhurdia in Georgia, from the Baltic states, and by the way, from certain areas in Russian Federation itself that were going to become an issue. So I think the reality is this is more a symptom than it is a cause. But the major point is, yes, the what I call the tribalism element, that is the the effort by the republics or elements of the republics to gain greater control over their own future was a fact. And it was a trend that ultimately was driving a major disintegration of the political authority of the center. And it really collapsed. Remember, the slogan always in the Soviet Union was nationalist informed, socialist in content. That meant you can have your nationalist defined governmental agencies, but the Communist Party is what's going to determine how the thing works. Well, when the Communist Party disappeared, it was even a greater invitation to say, well, if the government's in charge, then we're going to take our government seriously. Now, sorry, Matt, what was the second from the question?
The second question is about whether there would have been a way for this transition to happen that didn't open the stage to oligarchs to the same degree.
Well, I don't know. I mean, you know, I thought there was a wonderful sort of naivete, frankly, on the part of Americans coming to Russia or looking at Russia or talking to Russians about how they should do things in that extraordinary era of 1991, 92, where, you know, somehow you were supposed to have everything divided up equally and everybody would be an equal citizen with equal wealth. And so, oh, give me a break. You know, this doesn't exist anywhere in the world. So the idea that somehow all of the Soviet wheel, let's say in the Russian Federation, was going to be divided equally among all the citizens was kind of a naive idea from the beginning. The question of how it got carved up and how it was done certainly could have been done more equitably, in more orderly ways, with greater respect for procedures that were fair. But it's also true that in many ways, the idea that oligarchs simply grab things was not quite the case. I mean, what they did was, for instance, in the famous loans for shares issue, just as an example, the problem was the government was broke. The government was not collecting taxes. Andrei will know this. I mean, they couldn't. I remember Mr. Chubais at one point telling me he had 2 weeks of salaries left in the treasury. Well, what does a government when it's broke do? It borrows money. And who had money to borrow? Well, the oligarchs, the banks, and so forth had the money. And what they got in as security was things like oil fields and timber resources and big factories and so forth. The government couldn't pay the loans back. When they auctioned off something like an oil field, the problem was the people who could afford to take the risk of bidding on it were largely Russians. Exxon was not going to bid on an oil field that didn't have any known boundaries. There was no cadastral survey. They didn't know what was in them. And they didn't even have sure understanding of who owned it. So the question of, you know, how much are you willing to pay for an oil field like that? Well, it wasn't a lot. On the other hand, the Russian oligarchs knew how to manipulate the system. They could bid for them and acquire them. So there was a lot of ways in which oligarchs amassed their money that weren't particularly attractive. On the other hand, the system itself was almost impossibly structured at the time, and the government was so weak that the idea that you could make it a fair and equitable process was, frankly, just not very realistic.
Thanks so much, Jim. I just will add a comment of my own here as a student of Russian and Soviet history who studied in the 1990s and was both inspired and terrified in equal measure by stories of my fellow students and graduates going to the Wild East and having essentially Wild West type adventures, if you think about the kind of American popular culture of that. And one of the stories we think about coming out of the Wild West, which is just intuitively obvious to Americans, is of course the rise of the great robber barons out of all of the vast railroad and natural resource and and real estate opportunities that came from that experience. So we shouldn't have been so naive as to not anticipate this would happen. The other side of the Wild West story that we know so well are the gunfights and essentially mob justice, the posse going after the bad guy. Basically, no due process, very little actual rule of law in the way that we would have thought about it. And I think there's maybe some kind of lesson here about setting expectations in that kind of dramatic transition. But I can't help but offer that because it was something that felt very real to me at the time. Diana, I want to direct a specific question to you from Dominic Arpin, Senior Policy Advisor for Eastern Europe and Eurasia. Was a kind of Marshall Plan considered to help the reforms and transition in Russia at the time, presumably from the United States, or was there a certain satisfaction to see a weakened Russia, a view shared by at least a few Russians? Was an opportunity missed?
Dominic, there was significant debate within the United States. There were those who said lending money to Russia is money down a rat hole. And there were the others led by Yavlinsky and Graham Allison who said, look at the amount of money that you have spent on defense each year and devote some of that to creating an equivalent of a Marshall Plan. The Yavlinsky-Allison thesis was you have to support Russia and the independent states. Now, if not, they will go the same way as Germany after World War I. If you want to see an impoverished, humiliated country, you are going about it the right way. Yavlinsky and Allison saw the need for those funds. But I'm afraid that at the time, both the US Congress and a faction within the government said, ooh, don't lend money, that's gone down a rat hole.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Diana. I want to, and of course, that we'll leave that question on the table for anyone else to comment on, but I want to direct another audience questions coming in to Andrei. This is from Linda Liu, a reporter for the South China Morning Post, who asks, outside the USSR, the disintegration was arguably watched most closely and felt deeply in China, which has taken over as the world's largest communist regime, at least in name. What do the speakers, especially Andrei Kozyrev, think of the impact of the USSR collapse on China? And why do you think the communist regime in China has survived to celebrate its centenary this year while the Soviet Union failed? So Andrei, that question is to you. And again, just if you could come close to the microphone and speak loudly so we can hear.
Well, I have many questions about what happened in Russia, not to speak of looking deep in Chinese giant country and a giant culture. But my general idea always was that Deng Xiaoping was much better prepared to lead the reforms than any of the Soviet or post-Soviet leaders, including Gaidar and Yavlinsky. Neither Gaidar, nor Yavlinsky, nor others had any kind of exposure to real capitalism before that. While Deng Xiaoping, definitely, he lived in the United States, he was in business, even in the United States. So he probably had much more realistic idea of what it costs and how it works, the capitalism, which is the worst of the, like democracy is the worst of systems, except that all others are even worse. So that's of course paraphrasing Winston Churchill. So that was probably a factor, was leadership, that he provided much more sophisticated leadership for China. And Chinese leaders, communist bonzes, till today what happens now, it's very unclear. Probably they try to step back. But before that, and I personally knew quite well, I think, some of them in my tenure, they were able to maneuver and to open up economic transformations much better than the Soviet bureaucracy, which was intransigent and which was unable, probably also because of lack of exposure. But anyway, the Soviet looked like absolutely intransigent, while Chinese so far looked like much more flexible, despite Tiananmen. I mean, much more flexible, especially in economic field.
Thanks very much, Andrei. Let me direct this question to Jim. This is from Lilani Lansing, who asks, while this may be a happy day for the West, surely it must be a sad day for Moscow. This is my parenthetical, at least perhaps official Moscow. How will it be marked or perhaps celebrated in Moscow? This 30th anniversary, let's broaden it that way.
Well, that's a good question. It probably won't be celebrated, I guess, is the answer. I mean, how will it be interpreted? Well, Mr. Putin says in some sense that the collapse of the Soviet Union was the greatest tragedy of the 20th century. He, however, doesn't necessarily mean that the Soviet Union of Stalin was the best one or whatever. But basically, the Moscow capacity to shape the future of the Eurasian landmass was lost, and that it has been a challenge ever since. And I suppose that's the way it's seen in Moscow. Now, I suspect if you ask more broadly in Kiev or in Tbilisi or Bishkek, the views are, I suspect that the end of empire was in the end a positive thing. It has opened up opportunities. It has changed the way these nations have developed. And in fact, they are now independent countries. Sure, living next to Russia is complicated because it's a big power, but this is something a lot of countries in the world do. And I would assume that the fact of the matter is that very few people would share the view that they would like to go back to 1991. They did not see great prosperity and great prospects at that point. But certainly there is a sense of loss of prestige, loss of recognition as a great nation and so forth, that is played to by the people in charge in Moscow and cultivated by them. But the fact of the matter is, I think people my age and people Andrei's age, he's a young man, are the ones who are on the way out. The next generation increasingly will be one that doesn't remember anything of the Soviet Union or what it was. And the question is really going to be how are they going to define what is good for Russia? What is Russia to be? And one of the great things that has changed the entire world from 1991, when I remember, I had one of the 3 cell phones at the embassy, is that the capacity of governments, and that includes Moscow's government, to control their information space is simply non-existent. The reality is that we are all part of now of a global information space. And therefore, you cannot simply try to create an alternative universe the way the Soviet system did quite successfully until at least the mid-'80s. That is over, and therefore we are in a global situation. So I think the younger generation of Russians will have a different perspective on this than the people who are left over from a time when they think of the Soviet Union as the normal and right kind of arrangement. I just don't think the young people see it that way.
Thanks very much, Jim. We have 5 minutes remaining, and what I'd like to do, there are a number of other questions, some of which I feel like we've touched on more about the transition, privatization, et cetera, more about NATO, more about lessons for the wider world, China, Africa, et cetera. I'm going to apologize and beg the forgiveness of those questioners. And I'm going to ask each of you to take 1 minute as we conclude and imagine that you have the ear of President Biden in light of what is going on in the region and globally today, and you have the occasion of this 30th anniversary. What is the one lesson that you would underscore for the President of the United States today? And Andrei, I'm going to put you on the spot first.
First of all, I share a hopeful ending of Jim's presentation. There is future for Russia, and if ever the American government wanted to hear my advice, which haven't happened so far, I would tell them not to give up on Russia, especially because of this reason, that there will be probably new Russia coming with a new generation, hopefully. Secondly, I would advise to understand clearly that so far, right now, the other Russia is in charge, and it will go on against the United States, against the West, against Ukraine, because Ukraine tries to join the West as far as they can get away with. And talk, however sophisticated, however diplomatically justified, because diplomats try to believe that talking is always better than not, which I doubt. The talk will never be well understood on the other side. They respect the deeds, especially force, because they use force by themselves, including intimidation and deception. So they naturally inclined to believe in those instruments from the other side. So that would be my advice, double-edged. Like, one is be hopeful for the good Russia, but be very aware and prepared to act against this second Russia.
Diana, the word is next.
President Biden should be firm, but he should also work with NATO, as I understand he's doing now, to create a bridge so that the Eastern Europe countries can be discussed as to their relations with NATO. Thank you.
Jim, your advice.
Okay, my advice first would be to gather a group of people who can finally begin to discuss what a good relationship for the United States with Russia would look like. We do not know now. All we have is a list of demands. And secondly, I would say that it's time to think about the kind of approach that Europe as a whole, or the Euro-Atlantic world, took to the challenges of being divided back after the invasion of Czechoslovakia. It resulted in the Helsinki Accords. It was a diplomatic solution to how could a European divided live and change and find its way forward without threats of war. And I would say we are at that point again when we need to figure out how we deal diplomatically with a Europe that has divided itself again, but has to find a way to live together as one Euro-Atlantic world.
Well, let me thank all of you so much for taking the time, and let me thank our audience for tuning in, and our questioners for submitting some excellent inquiries, and my apologies to those I didn't get to. I think this could not be a more timely occasion, not only for marking an anniversary, which is always timely, but amid the events and major developments today, this conversation has extra weight. Thank you for living up to that challenge, to all three of you. We'll see you next time.